This is definitely the most asked question that I get on all my platforms, from Instagram to TikTok to YouTube, and I get why you guys care so much about this question, because if you own a camera from this brand, this is the whole point of owning a camera from that brand. And the question is, what film simulation do I use on my Fuji cameras? Let's talk about it. Now, it is tough. Well, hold on, I'm gonna watch. Now, the reason I say it is the most asked question is because if you own a Fuji camera like myself, you want to know, how do I get that signature Fuji film-esque look with the camera? And this is not a one-size-fits-all answer. There are a ton, in fact, an infinite number of possibilities and different recipes that you can build with Fuji cameras, but photographers like myself like to stay in one lane and find a distinct look that I personally use for basically 99% of the work that I shoot with my Fuji cameras, including this one, the XM5, including the GFX 100 RF that Fuji, that one there, has given me on loan for a few weeks. All these cameras, doesn't even matter what sensor each of these cameras have, it just is a signature look that, as photographers, once you find it, you kind of stick with it. And if you have a Fuji camera, if you just bought one or have had one for a while, let me debunk a bit of a myth for you. The first time I bought a Fuji camera was the Fuji X100V, and I spent the first 4, maybe 6 months with that camera not loving the JPEG images that I was getting out of the camera because I wasn't really properly dialing in or understanding the camera capabilities that come with the Fuji settings. Yes, the film sim is a big one, but there are a ton of other things we need to talk about within the camera settings that are really going to bring the images to life. Alright, first up, let's look at some example images that I've taken on all kinds of Fuji cameras. Now, you can see there is a bit of a consistent theme or look to all the images. I prefer a very warm look, maybe tinted towards the greens a bit, and definitely, like I said, yellows, oranges, those warm hues. I like rich, deep blacks that are sometimes a bit lifted, but for the most part are just deep and rich, while also not completely just crushing them where I have no details in the shadows. And I also like highlights that are retained quite a bit. I don't like to blow out my highlights at all. I like to retain as much information from them and keep them basically as not white as possible. And so in this video, I'm going to break down the exact film recipe that I use on all my Fuji cameras and a few pro tips to really achieve that look. Alright, so as a base, if you don't know what Fuji X Weekly is, it is a blog. I'm not sure exactly who started the blog, but it is a blog that has a ton of Fuji recipes as blog posts that have been built up over the years. Literally hundreds of different film recipes for Fuji cameras that have been built up and written about with examples, and you can basically take these settings and put it into your camera. Now again, I've been shooting with Fuji cameras for a couple of years now, so I've tried out a ton of different recipes, and the one that I always fall back on as kind of my base preset, let's call it my base recipe, is one called Kodachrome 64. Kodachrome 64, there, I said it. That is the preset, the recipe that I use for all my images, and that is not a lie. I love this recipe so much. I've done all of them. Portrait 400, Portrait 160, Gold 200. I've done so many different recipes on Fuji X Weekly, and they're all great, they're all amazing, but the one that really stands the test of time with me, the one that really resonates with me as a photographer, is this one, the Kodachrome 64. But there are a few caveats, and let's talk about it. In fact, I think the best way to do this is if I actually grab my GFX and go one by one and break down this entire recipe and explain in a very concise but effective way why I choose each of the settings I choose for this particular recipe. Okay, so the base film simulation that you are going to use for this recipe is called Classic Chrome. Now on the camera, they describe it as soft color and enhanced shadow contrast for a calm look. I guess that is pretty accurate, but we do make some adjustments from there. But Classic Chrome is your first step. Set that as your film simulation. And oh, by the way, for all these settings, I'm going to go in order of what this menu has and not in order of importance, but just to follow along, it'll be in order of what the menu lists each of these settings as. Next, I have the grain effect set to weak and small. I've done strong, I've done rough, I've done off, I've done all of them, and I like the weak and small. Sometimes I turn it off just to to have no grain at all, and I add my own grain in post. But if you really don't want to have any extra steps after the fact, I would personally set it to weak and small. Next up, we have the color chrome effect, which I have set to strong. And basically, the color chrome effect is what adds richness and vividness and depth to different levels of saturation and colors and tonality in the scene. It's honestly a pretty technical thing that I don't even understand, but I've just done some A/B testing of the exact same scene, and overall, like the preset on the Fuji X weekly site suggests, I have it turned on. Next up is the Color Chrome FX Blue, and I have this one set to weak. I actually don't typically like blues in my image, but when you have absolutely no blues, it can sometimes look overall desaturating and a bit lifeless, so I don't want to overly pronounce the blues, very much like the regular Color Chrome effect. I want to just subtly enhance the blues, so for this one, I have it set to weak. Next up is the dynamic range setting, and this one basically helps to retain highlight detail in a few different settings. So, for example, the one that I have it set to on this recipe is DR200, which will retain or reduce the highlight detail by one full stop. The caveat to that, which it sounds great by retaining the detail by one stop, the caveat is that it has a minimum ISO of 320. So if you're in a very contrasty environment and you want to make sure you retain as much highlight detail as possible, you can play with using either DR200 or DR400. I like DR200 as a middle ground because I do like shooting higher contrast environments, especially with a camera like the GFX 100 RF. But again, this setting is not going to be a make it or break it. I prefer just having it straight down the middle at DR200. Now, we're actually going to skip the next two settings, white balance and tone curve, because never mind. I'm not even going to talk about it. Those are let's skip for now. Next is color. Color, I have it set to +2 because I find that with the classic chrome subduing a lot of those tones, bringing back some of those colors with the color scale up to +2 can give the photos a bit more life. Sharpness, I have set to 0. High ISO noise reduction, I have set to 0 as well. Clarity is set to 0, and that is pretty much it for all of the settings except for the two that I skipped over: white balance and tone curve. Now let's pause. Let's breathe for a second, because this is a really important step, and this is what will really bring your images to life: the white balance setting and the tone curve. Let's actually start with the tone curve. Now, the tone curve setting is divided up into two parts: the highlights and the shadows. So for highlights, a positive number above 0 will make the highlights more bright and more pronounced, and therefore more blown out, more white, whereas a negative number below 0 will make the highlights less white, less bright, less pronounced, and more gray. And that's what I prefer. For this recipe, we have the highlights set to -2, which on the GFX 100 RF is the lowest value you can go to. And then the other one is shadows. Now, a positive number above 0 is going to make your shadows much more deep, much more rich and black, whereas a negative number is going to lift your shadows and bring in more detail, less dark, less contrast, less black. And for this recipe, we want to kind of subtly lift the blacks without making them too flat. So I have mine set to -1, but sometimes, depending on the setting, I will also change it back to -0.5 or even 0. I find that if I'm in a extremely high contrast environment, I'm definitely going to bring it down to -1, because the blacks are going to be so rich in the image already, the shadows that is, are going to be so rich in the photo already, that I'm going to want to bring up some detail in those shadows. Whereas in a less contrasty setting, I might bring that shadow setting up to -0.5 or even 0 to introduce or add more contrast to the scene. This is a common thing that I'm adjusting all the time depending on the environment that I'm shooting. But for now, like I said, let's have it set to -1. Alright, and then last but not least, the white balance. And this is the most important setting for every single recipe, including this one. And if you don't know what white balance is basically telling your camera what true white looks like. So if I held up, actually, one sec. If I hold up a piece of white paper like this. What color would you say this white paper is? And be honest, this is not a trick question. What color does this look like right now? Now, you would probably say, hopefully, you'd probably say something like a green, yellowy tint. It's not completely pure white, and you'd be correct. That is because of the white balance setting that I currently have set on this Fuji XM5. Let me explain. Right now I have my Fuji XM5 set to a custom white balance of 6500 Kelvin. And if you don't know what Kelvin is, basically it's a technical term, a scientific term to describe how warm or cool the white light is that is coming out of the thing, the light, or in this case, the white balance. 6500 on a scale of Kelvin is typically pretty warm, which is why this white paper looks warm. But if I put this footage into Premiere Pro where I edit my videos and I do an auto white balance on this white paper, which might mess up the rest of my scene, it will make this paper correctly white, even though the rest of my scene is now all messed up. It'll make the paper correctly white. Okay, back to the regular footage. Now, try and follow along here. On the Fuji cameras, when you shoot JPEG images, or in this case, video, if you bake in a Kelvin temperature or a white balance into the photo or video, you cannot really adjust it after the fact. You can, technically, but you won't have a lot of latitude or adjustment capabilities as you would with a RAW file, either a RAW photo or RAW video. This is not RAW video, this is video with a baked-in recipe, and your JPEG photos are also photos with baked-in white balance settings as well. So on camera, white balance is controlled with a Kelvin temperature, while on the computer, when you go to edit your photos or videos, it is adjusted with two things, temperature and tint. Temperature you'll see with an orange and blue slider, warm and cool, and tint you'll see with a magenta or green slider, magenta to green. Now, bear with me, last detail about this, I promise. On the Fuji cameras, and most cameras actually, when you go to set your white balance setting, in this case 6500 Kelvin, you can also add what's called a white balance shift. And that shift will literally shift the white point of your image on top of the Kelvin temperature that you just chose, whether it's on auto, whether it's on daylight, whether it's on a custom Kelvin temperature like it is right now. That white balance shift is on top of that. And so all that to be said, there are basically two different white balance settings that I am going to adjust with this recipe, again, depending on what I'm shooting. Let me break it down for you. For anything daytime or natural light, I'm going to have my white balance set to daylight with a white balance shift of red +2 and blue -5, and that's what this looks like on the white balance shift graph. This is going to give my images that signature warm and a little bit green tinted hue. Again, going back to the start of the video, that is what gives these images that signature look. And then the other scenario that I find myself shooting in with this camera is with artificial light or things that are more indoors and less daylight driven. And for that, I'm going to have my white balance set to auto white balance. And then on top of that auto white balance, I'm going to add a white balance shift of red to +1 and blue to -5. Very subtle, very similar to the daylight, but again, just a little bit of a shift geared more towards artificial light as opposed to real daylight. And I cannot stress this enough, white balance is where the images really come alive with Fuji cameras. Obviously, yes, the film sim, obviously the tone curve, obviously all those other settings that are equally as important on Fuji cameras, but the white balance, for me at least, I think the white balance is really just the creme de la creme of what makes these images look the way that they do. But wait, there's more. I know. If I haven't lost it already, there's one more thing, I promise, we're almost done. There's one more very important step that I think is also as crucial as everything else we talked about today to give that look to these images, and that is something called exposure compensation. Again, a lot of the recipes that are on Fuji X Weekly will have recommended exposure compensation settings built into the recipe. I have my exposure compensation set to a 2/3 stop below even exposure, basically exposing down by 2/3 of a full stop. And almost every Fuji camera looks different for this setting. On the GFX, it's up here on the top. It looks like an actual dial, and I literally turn the dial downwards towards 2/3 of a stop below 0. And for me, it just adds that richness to the images. And a little bonus to all that is that because you are exposing down, you technically are saving the highlights from being blown out, which in general will look better for your images. Okay, God, that was exhausting just talking about it. I hope you guys followed along with this video. I'm going to have all the details written out below for this Fuji recipe that I use on every single one of my Fuji photos. If you guys like this video, make sure you guys hit that subscribe button. Thank you guys so much for the support on this channel. I always appreciate it. But until next time, I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace. Focus. Peace. Wow, that's fast. Peace.